Hey guys, Landon Schropp from Unraveling Flexbox here. In this video, I'm going to walk you through some of the basic Flexbox properties by showing you how to make the faces of dice. So if you're not familiar with them, these are the faces of playing dice. Now each die has little black dots on it called pips, and the number of pips on each face denotes the value. So our goal in this video is going to be to represent all of these faces with HTML and CSS. And of course, we're going to be doing it with Flexbox. So to get started, let's write the HTML for the very first die. One thing to know in each one of these videos is that there's going to be a little section towards the top that begins and ends with 3 dashes. It's completely safe to ignore this. This is just an artifact of the system that I'm using to render the code. So, how do we represent the face of a die using HTML? Well, the easiest way would be to use divs for the face and to use spans for the pips. So, that's what we'll do. Now, as you can see, I've added a few styles to make life a little easier. Since these styles aren't really related to Flexbox, I'm not going to dig into them too deeply. But if you'd like, you can look at the source code for the examples and see how they work for yourself. So, the first step to styling the first face is to make it a flex container. So this doesn't actually look any different, but there's a lot going on under the hood. So the first face container now has a horizontal main axis. The main axis of a flex container can be horizontal or it can be vertical, but the default is horizontal. So if we were to add another pip to the face of the die, it would show up to the right of the first pip, and that's really what the main axis dictates. So the justify content property determines how the items in a flex container are aligned along the main axis. Since we want to center the pip along the main axis, we'll use the center value. The align items property dictates how items are laid out along the cross axis. So because we want the pip to center along this axis as well, we'll also use the center value. And just like that, we have the first face of the die. Traditionally, horizontally and vertically centering an item inside of a container has been one of the hardest things to do without Flexbox. But, as you can see now, it's really, really easy with just a few lines of code. Okay, so let's tackle the second face now. So how is the first face different than the second face? Well, they're pretty similar. The only things that really need to change are the first face class needs to be changed to second face, and we need to add another pip. While we're at it, let's go ahead and make the second face a flex container. So now you have 2 pips that are lined up right next to each other. And like we said before, since the main axis is horizontal, the second pip is just to the right of the first pip. So what we really want is for that second pip to show up on the far right side of the die. So it turns out that there's a value for justify content that will let us move it to the right side. So the space between property evenly fills the space between flex items. Now, since there are only 2 flex items in this container, it's going to push them as far away as possible. So here's where we run into a problem. Before, we used align items to align the pips along the cross axis. But if we try to do it here, it's going to affect both pips. So it turns out that there's a handy little property called align self that we can set on items inside of a flex container. This property lets you align each item individually, regardless of how the other items in the flex container are aligned. So, since we want to move it to the end of the flex container, the value that we'll use is flex end. Okay, let's go ahead and skip the third face and tackle the fourth. Now this one is a little bit trickier than the others because we need to support 2 columns. and each column needs to have 2 pips. So there are 2 things about Flexbox that's going to make this a lot easier for us. The first is that the main axis can be horizontal or vertical inside of Flex containers. And the second is that Flex containers can be nested. So unlike before, our markup will now include columns. And just like we did before, let's go ahead and make the 4th face a Flex container. So, since we want the 2 columns to be on opposite sides of the Flex container, let's go ahead and use justify content space between, like we did for the 2nd face. Next, we need to make the columns Flex containers. We can also change their direction, so the main axis is vertical, by using the Flex Direction property. So it doesn't look any different, but like before, there's now a lot going on under the hood. So the final step is to set the Justify Content property for the columns. And that's it. 3 faces down and 3 faces to go. So at this point, you have everything you need to build the other 3 faces. So why not give it a shot? When you're done, you can take a look at the code examples for the answers.